whites, and neither did native black Philadelphians, want Southern blacks coming into Philadelphia in 1917. But that didn't stop them from coming. Oh, it did not. They came because they were invited. Now, who invited them? Business owners. Business owners who were in desperate need of their services. And since they paid more money than what these blacks earned in the South, they figured, why not take the offer and go somewhere new? And that's exactly what they did. But when they arrived, they found Philadelphia to be something different than what they expected. Now, we'll find out what happened by continuing to read from the 1920 book titled Negro Migration During the War, written by Emmett J. Scott. Respect. Although not so closely connected with the Black Belt of the South as are so many of the industrial centers of the West, Pennsylvania, nevertheless, was sought by many of these migrants because of the long-accepted theory that this commonwealth maintains a favorable attitude toward persons of color. Many of the abolitionists came out of Philadelphia. The Quakers were largely situated in Philadelphia, and historically it had been a place of refuge during slavery, where people of the rich brown complexion could find some measure of peace and dignity. So this hopeful image is what many Southern Negroes held in their mind, which lured them into this city. It drew upon this population too, because of the very urgent need for workers in its numerous industries during the labor crisis resulting from the falling off of the foreign immigration. Remember, prior to World War I, European foreign immigrants had been rushing into the country by the millions. But once the war cracked off, the U.S. prevented many new immigrants from entering, and a lot of them had to return to their home country to fight. So this caused a labor shortage in many northern cities, including Philadelphia. When, moreover, manufacturing establishments of the state multiplied as elsewhere because of the demand for the manufacture of munitions of war, this need became more urgent than ever. They needed to manufacture products for the war: bullets, grenades, ship parts, and a whole array of things to support the war. And these things weren't going to produce themselves. So in this desperate moment, Philadelphia needed workers badly. And like Superman swooping in, Negroes came to the rescue. The chief factors in the bringing in of these Negroes from the South were the leading railroads like the Erie and Pennsylvania. During the shortage of labor, these corporations found it impossible to keep their systems in repair. In this situation, they, like the smaller concerns further west, sent labor agents to the South to induce Negroes to supply this demand. Here we go. The manufacturing companies sent labor agents to the South to rapture Negroes. Remember, the labor agents were tiptoeing in the South, very quiet, like a thief in the night, and people had a hard time identifying who they were. The only thing people knew is when the sun began to rise, there was 1,000 Negroes missing from the region, going off to the north to places like Philadelphia. Unfortunately, however, so many of the Negroes who had their transportation paid by these firms counted it more profitable to leave their employ immediately after arriving because of the unusually high wages offered by smaller industries in just as urgent need of labor. Negroes weren't loyal to any of those companies, just like those companies certainly were not loyal to them. So when they got to the north and they quickly discovered that another company was offering higher pay than the ones who paid for their ticket, they jumped ship. Now, I'm not saying that this was the right thing to do. I'm only saying that this is what they did. Instead of supplying their own demand, therefore, the railroads were benefiting their neighbors. In Philadelphia, the situation at first became unusually critical. Being closer to the Southland than most of the large cities of the country, the people of Philadelphia are much more prejudiced against the Negro than those in some other northern cities. He says much more prejudiced, which means that it wasn't the city of brotherly love like many Negroes had imagined it to be. It was necessary, therefore, upon their arrival in that city for them to crowd into the district largely restricted to Negroes, giving rise to such unhappy conditions as to jeopardize the peace and health of the community. The whites made sure they were funneled into the basement of the city, the area restricted for Negroes, where the homes were neglected, the neighborhood unkept, rents were high, the infrastructure was crumbling, and the vibrational frequency of the area was low. Numbers of these migrants died from exposure during the first winter, and others who died because of their inability to stand the northern climate made the situation seem unusually alarming. This is what the minister talked about earlier in the book, the one who was attempting to stop Negroes from leaving the South. But he made up figures and said that 2,000 Negroes froze to death in Philadelphia, which was wild. But it was true that some Negroes did bite the dust from the cold. It was necessary, therefore, to organize social workers to minister to the peculiar needs of these newcomers. Appeals were made in their behalf, and a number of prominent citizens felt that it was necessary to urge them to remain in the South. Too crowded, too much disease, too much group tension, and a wave of Southern Negroes unprepared for Northern life. All reasons why they would have urged them to stay in the South. The solution of this problem was rendered a little more difficult for the reason that here, as in many other centers in the North, the newcomers were not welcomed by their own race. Uh-oh, it's about to get spicy. Philadelphia had for years been pointed to as having a respectable, thrifty, and prosperous colored population, enjoying the goodwill and the cooperation of the best white people in the community. We talked about this in the Philadelphia Negro by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, 1899. There was a class of blacks who were known to be respectable, with good morals, and were culturally prepared for the civilized world. These Northern Negroes felt then that the coming of their brethren in the rough did them a decided injury in giving rise to a race problem in a Northern community where it had not before figured. This was the same trend that had been repeatedly occurring in Philadelphia. A relatively small group of blacks had been there for quite some time. Now, when it was just them there, they experienced minimal issues with other groups. Then, after a period of time, there would be these waves of blacks rushing into the city from the South, primarily, which resulted in tension amongst the groups, and it would diminish the good reputation of the older blacks. Then, after some time, once everything appeared to have settled down, another wave of Negroes would rush into the city and start the same cycle all over again. And if we remember, the main ones coming into the city at that time were young, single people, which a portion of them included these experienced underworld Negroes that would take root in the black community, right? That's the history. But at this point in 1917, apparently the racial issues had settled or at least been minimized again. And now a much larger wave of Negroes had rushed into the city. And from the eyes of the respectable blacks, the issue is that the Southern Negroes have a demeanor and they have a way of acting and a way of living that largely tarnishes the reputation of the black group. And it compromises what the community had built and the reputation that it had made for itself. This is the issue that they had with them. This unusual influx of other members of the race greatly stimulated that tendency to segregate Negro children in the schools, to the deep regret of the older citizens of Philadelphia. You see? And a lot of those blacks loved having their kids go to school with the whites. So this must have been very heartbreaking for them. Other social privileges, as in theaters, churches, and the like, formerly allowed the Negro citizens of that city, tended gradually to be withdrawn. Too many Negroes at this point. And like we have mentioned in previous commentaries, the whites did not distinguish between segments of blacks. They held them as all the same, which meant since they were identified as blacks, and the new element of people who came into town acting a fool were also identified as blacks, then each and every one of them, every single one of them, plus the little kids and the newborn babies, they all got tossed into the same bucket, and they got kicked out of the white establishments. That's how they got down. The Negro migrants were not altogether innocent, which we should already know. People do you a serious disservice when they narrate the story and they make it seem as if blacks were just these completely helpless victims who had no faults and did no wrongs. We should already know that this was not the case. Not with that mind they inherited from the enslaved ancestors. Oh no. We should already know that a lot of blacks were coming into town doing things that were not in their best interest. Many of them used their liberty in their northern home as a stumbling block. A stumbling block is something that makes you fall, or it blocks you from making progress. And these new liberties in the North were stumbling blocks to many Negroes because they were not used to being this free. Receiving their such high wages which they could not judiciously spend, the unwise of their group used this unusually large income to their own detriment and to that of the community, spending most of their money on madness and ruining the reputation of the community. This is what the older, respectable members were concerned about. That's why they did not want them in this city. It was indeed difficult to restrain a poor man who never had had a few dollars, when just arrived from a section of the country where he had not only been poor, but restricted even in expending what income he received. Many of them received $6, $7, and in a few cases $8 to $10 a day. They frequented saloons and dens of vice, thereby increasing the number of police court cases and greatly staining the record of the Negroes in that city. You hear that? Greatly staining the record of Negroes in that city. You know how when you greatly stain a shirt so bad that the stain won't come off? In that case, what do you usually do? Throw it away and get a new one, right? That's what eventually became the situation for the Negro and black reputation. Understand? Now let's continue. A number of fracases, therefore, broke out from time to time, growing in intensity in keeping with the condition to which the community, unaccustomed to Negro neighbors, saw fit to manifest its displeasure. The white community grew more agitated towards blacks because they were not used to living amongst so many of them, and their resentment intensified. This finally culminated in the recent riots in Philadelphia, in which a number of blacks and whites were killed. It got wild. Feeling that they did not have the support of the officers of the law, the Negroes of the city organized a colored protective association and raised a fund for the prosecution of policemen and others who might aid mobs. Now, when I sit back and think about the common stereotype about blacks not being able to organize, I have to step back to correct my own views to accurately match the reality. Blacks may not be good at organizing in many areas, but areas that they are very good at organizing in is against police and against the white power system. I give them solid A+ in these departments, because if they feel that whites or anything that whites are in control of is targeting them or taking advantage of them, then they have historically organized very well to respond. And what we are seeing here is an example of this. The method of strengthening itself is to organize the churches of the city with a view to securing the cooperation of every Negro there. Here it comes. To advance this work, a large sum has been raised. Other efforts of this sort in behalf of the Negroes in Philadelphia have been made by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Armstrong Association in cooperation with the National League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes. You see that? They organized and cooperated very well to raise large sums of money to deal with police corruption. And here are a few more ways in which they organized to help the incoming blacks. Social workers in general soon found it necessary to address themselves to the task of readjusting these migrants. The Philadelphia Academy of Medicine, composed of Negro physicians, dentists, and druggists, put into effect measures calculated to meet requirements for housing, sanitation, medical attention, and education. Systematic medical inspections were given, and projects for the erection of houses and the adaptation of existing buildings for lodgings are underway. 80 Negro physicians of the city collected information which took the form of a weekly report of the Bureau of Health. Real estate dealers were asked to submit lists of every house immediately available for the relief of the overcrowded buildings then occupied by the Negroes, and to provide hundreds of new ones. cheaply but substantially constructed. Stereopticon lectures and talks were given on an increasing scale in all the Negro churches, telling the new arrivals how to care for themselves in the Philadelphia climate, how to avoid colds, which lead to pneumonia and tuberculosis, the two most common diseases among them, and other useful information in general. These were all things they had to take into their own hands because nobody else was going to do it for them. So they were really working together to deal with these housing and sanitary issues. And this is a really good thing. The Interdenominational Ministerial Union of Philadelphia, embracing all the Negro ministers of the city, drew up certain resolutions setting forth their views relative to the migration and making some suggestions concerning the situation in Philadelphia. They pledged themselves to look after the comfort of the migrants in every way possible, urged them to join the churches and other organizations for improvement, and send their children to the schools, and to utilize the libraries, night schools, and other agencies of culture which were denied them in the South. These ministers urged them also to work regularly and give their best services to their employers regardless of pay, remembering always that the race is on trial in them, that they save their money and purchase homes and become a part of the substantial citizenry as soon as possible, encouraging them to adjust their ways, because the Southern way of life they brought with them was not going to cut it, not in the Northern city. So obviously this was the right guidance if they wanted them to succeed, which they obviously did. So this right here was a bit of the background on the reaction of this wave of Negroes coming into Philadelphia. It got wild in the city, as we can see, and we can also see how blacks pulled together to help each other out during this tough time of turmoil, right? So this was very good. So we have a couple more things to cover in this book, so stay tuned because we're going to also discover some of the other reactions to Negroes migrating to the North during the early 1900s. And so I thank you right now for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.